April 15th, 1951. He is an icon even while still on active duty. A World War II hero, I shall return, and the genius who planned the Incheon landing, which turned this war around last September. He is Douglas MacArthur, and this week, he is fired. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, a letter from UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur made public convinced the powers that be that he must be removed from command. In the field, Operation Rugged began, and though it took ground, it presented a new issue in the form of the Hwacheon Dam, which might be used by the enemy to flood the whole area. In fact, as last week ended, Chinese troops and Korean power plant employees at the dam began opening the sluice gates in an attempt to do just that. However, as we saw, the dam is not near full capacity, and they only managed to fully open 4 of 18 sluice gates and raise 6 more a bit. This still releases a lot of water from the reservoir, but it doesn't cause any UN casualties, since U.S. 9th Corps Commander William Hogue had already moved his forces away from the Hwacheon River lowlands. The waters do, though, raise the river by over 2 meters, which either destroys or forces the removal of floating bridges both north and south of Choncheon. By the morning of the 9th, the Chinese troops that had held back units of 1st Cavalry Division last week have withdrawn behind the river to avoid being trapped by the flood. And the only Chinese units south of the river hold the ridge leading to the dam. With their opposition gone, the 7th and 8th Cavalry Regiments reached the Kansas line by noon. So Hogue tells 1st Cavalry Division Commander Charles Palmer to launch the operation to take the dam, the details of which I went over last week. However, if you'll remember, 1st Marine Division is set to relieve 1st Cavalry Division, and that is to happen the 10th. So Palmer tells 7th Cavalry Regiment Commander Wild Bill Harris to finish the operation already by the end of the day. Well, it's supposed to be a lightning thing anyhow, done by Harris' 2nd Battalion and an attached Ranger Company. But you know, that's pretty hasty planning, though they do try it. Thing is, there's just one road to use here, more dirt track than road, and sure, it runs along the reservoir shore northward past the Kansas line position, but it's so narrow and with so many rock outcroppings along it that even jeeps have a tough time making it through. Armor certainly cannot, and neither can most of the artillery, so 2nd Battalion Commander John Calloway does not have much fire support when he gets moving. In fact, there is exactly one 155mm howitzer that can reach the dam at maximum range, and that is not effective support. The companies of the battalion advance, and troops try to clear the road a bit, but eventually enemy machine guns and mortars pin down Company F, the lead company, until night falls and it withdraws. Thing is, Company F was supposed to occupy Hill 454 overlooking the dam, and then the Rangers would move to the dam along the edge of the reservoir and immobilize the gates. So that doesn't happen either. So even though 1st Cavalry Division is to leave the lines the 10th, Hogue and Palmer want another shot at the dam that day. Hogue still thinking in terms of raids, and Palmer thinking that Calloway only really needed more time the 9th, and then he would have succeeded. So while the rest of the division is moving out, 7th Cavalry stays in the lines, and 2nd Battalion tries again. Calloway thinks maybe the enemy is doing like they always do lately and has retreated, so he doesn't change tactics. And so he has the same results. His companies get held up. Hogue calls for one more try against the dam the 11th then, before 7th Cavalry leaves the line. Harris is authorized to use his entire regiment this time, and his new plan is for a diversionary attack to the northwest across the Hwacheon, to send the 2nd Battalion again up the peninsula, and to send the Rangers across the reservoir in boats to attack the dam from the east. The 1st Battalion will do the diversion, and the 3rd will either back up the 2nd or follow the Rangers. They now have at least a few batteries of artillery as support, but rain, sleet, snow, and fog prevents any help from the skies. The Rangers managed to get some of their guys, some artillery spotters, and a machine gun section across the water just around dawn without attracting any enemy attention. But they take machine gun fire when they move up to high ground above their landing spot. The following waves of Rangers trying to cross are not as fortunate as the first wave and do attract enemy attention. to the point where some have to return to the south shore. And the Rangers that manage to cross use up most of their ammunition fighting off Chinese attacks already by the middle of the morning. And on top of that, Chinese units are moving across the dam from west to east to help deal with the Rangers. So 3rd Battalion is sent in to back them up. But just one company, I Company, makes it across in force by the middle of the afternoon. As for the other attacks, the diversion dies already in the recon stages when heavy Chinese fire prevents any and all 1st Battalion attempts to find a crossing of the flooded Hwacheon River. And the 2nd Battalion is stalled in its advance just like it was the last 2 days. Harris also realizes the rest of 3rd Battalion won't make it across the reservoir until after dark. And he's worried about a nighttime Chinese counterattack against Company I and the Rangers, so he orders them to withdraw. They make it down to the shore from the high ground by dusk, and then head back across the reservoir by night. Hogue decides to not make any more separate attacks here, and 7th Cavalry is finally relieved. Hogue attributed the 7th Cavalry's failure to reach the dam principally to the loss of surprise. Sharing the cause were hasty planning, shortages of equipment, particularly amphibious gear, and lack of normal direct support artillery fire. Certainly the canalized terrain and the strength and fortified position of the defending forces also contributed. In any case, Ridgway meanwhile had ordered the opening of Operation Dauntless. Hogue elected to wait until then, when the dam would be an objective of a full 9th Corps advance to Line, Wyoming. Ridgway sets the opening date for Operation Dauntless already April 9th, and its opening phase, beginning already on the 11th, is primarily a 1st Corps operation to the west of the peninsula. But there is something a lot bigger going on than Dauntless the 11th, and that is Douglas MacArthur being relieved of his command. We know that U.S. President Harry Truman has wanted to relieve him for the past few weeks, but it isn't until the 9th, as this week begins, that Truman actually reveals his personal position to those he met with last week. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Omar Bradley, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and Advisor Averell Harriman. Truman wants MacArthur out and Matt Ridgway to replace him. Jim Van Fleet will take Ridgway's place as commander of 8th Army in Korea. There's discussion about whether the public announcement should mention that all of the Joint Chiefs and all of Truman's top guys are for this as well. And at the final meeting, when a staffer suggests Truman say he is doing this at the suggestion of the Joint Chiefs and senior officials, Truman says, "Not tonight, son. There'll be plenty of time for that later. But tonight, I'm taking this decision on my own responsibility as President of the United States, and I want no one to think I'm trying to share it with anyone else. That will all come out in 48 or 72 hours. But as of tonight, this is my decision, and my decision alone." You may not believe it, but MacArthur kind of knows this is coming. He sees 10th Corps Commander Ned Almond, one of his main acolytes, just the day before, and says goodbye, and that he may not see him around anymore. Almond wonders why, and Mac tells him that he might be relieved. Almond thinks it absurd, but it is the truth. The announcement, though, is very badly handled. The dismissal is to be presented to the public as a fait accompli. Secretary of the Army Frank Pace recently arrived in Japan for a routine tour, and at the moment is in Korea, so he's supposed to deliver the order to MacArthur. They don't want the word to get out prematurely, so the order and Ridgway's reassignment order are sent in diplomatic code by Acheson to John Muccio, U.S. Ambassador to South Korea at Busan. He is to give the orders to Pace, and Pace is to go to Tokyo and meet MacArthur at 10 a.m. local time the 12th, which is 8 p.m. the 11th in Washington. This meeting is to take place privately at MacArthur's American Embassy residence. Simultaneously, General John Hull is to give Ridgway his new orders. Right, that's the plan. Acheson sends off the orders through the commercial cable the afternoon of the 10th, but by midnight still has not gotten word that Muccio has received it. It turns out that a power failure in Busan has prevented the cable from being received, unknown to Acheson or the wire service. Meanwhile, a Chicago newspaper, acting on a tip from the paper's Japanese bureau, starts asking Pentagon officials about which big figure's impending resignation have they been hearing about. Well, Bradley warns Truman that in Chicago they might break the story the 11th before MacArthur has received his orders. And Truman tells Bradley straight out, "That son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired." So Truman says to issue new and clear orders immediately through the military communications network, one straight to MacArthur relieving him, and one to Pace to tell Ridgway about his new job. Truman also calls a press conference for 1 a.m. that night to announce all this. "With deep regret, I have concluded that General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and of the United Nations. I have therefore relieved General MacArthur of his commands and have designated Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway as his successor." 1 in the morning, the 11th in D.C., is already 3 in the afternoon in Tokyo, and it's about then that the relief order reaches MacArthur's headquarters. Mac himself does not get it for another half hour or so because he's not there. He's at the residence finishing a long lunch with some guests. He actually gets word of it from one of his aides who hears it over a Tokyo radio station. Now, it is an accident that the public hears about it before MacArthur, but it certainly adds an element of callousness to those who don't know the details, which includes MacArthur for the moment. Since the order is effective at once, Mac gives his command to his acting Chief of Staff Doyle Hickey until Ridgway can take over. So what's up with Ridgway anyhow? Well, on the 11th, he's in the field all day, touring the units that make up Operation Dauntless. He eventually gets wind of things and goes to Busan the morning of the 12th to meet Muccio, and then on to Tokyo. He and MacArthur have a meeting there on the change of command and go over Ridgway's new responsibilities. Ridgway decides that instead of taking up things right away, he'll go back to Korea and run 8th Army until Van Fleet arrives the 14th. He does, however, as pretty much his first action, install a telephone in MacArthur's former office to have a direct connection with the rest of the world. So, on the 13th, he winds up his affairs as 8th Army commander, and this includes his troop rotation system. Both officers and enlisted men will be eligible to return to the States after serving 6 months with a division or other separate combat unit. But it's a full year if it's higher levels of command, or not with combat units, but with separate service units. Or the two could be combined, like 3 months with a combat unit and 6 months with a service unit. The catch is, you can't leave until your replacement has actually joined your unit. This system means that there are already like 75,000 men eligible to return to the U.S. So they're going to send them back in monthly quotas based on expected replacements. Fortunately for those men, there are way more replacements than there are casualties at the moment. So the big R, which is what this rotation system will be known as, is set to send home the first quota of men next week on the 22nd. Ridgway spends the rest of the day going over plans with his corps commanders. They have set up several lines of withdrawal should an enemy offensive develop and push them from the Kansas line, even as far back as the defense of Seoul. The officers meeting with Ridgway could offer little new information about the enemy's readiness to attack. Although the 1st Corps in pushing towards line Utah and the 10th and Rock 3rd Corps in continuing towards line Kansas had encountered stiffening opposition over the past few days, the assault forces had discovered no indication that the enemy offensive was imminent other than the filling of tank traps previously dug along axes of 8th Army advance. In the absence of other evidence, Ridgway and the assembled corps commanders agreed that the enemy forces had no intention of attacking in the immediate future. I say this because the Joint Chiefs have told Ridgway that he can keep control of 8th Army for a while if he wants and use Van Fleet for something else because of any impending enemy offensives. But Ridgway declines this and turns over 8th Army to Jim Van Fleet at 5 p.m. on the 14th. Ridgway then again heads for Tokyo, arriving that evening and going to the Imperial Hotel. He wishes to avoid UN Command Headquarters until MacArthur has left for the States. There has been the worry that Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida and his cabinet would resign over the MacArthur issue, but Yoshida says that's not going to happen. Truman sends John Foster Dulles to Japan anyhow to personally guarantee Yoshida there is no coming change of policy. Ridgway also issues a statement to both the Japanese and foreign press, which says basically the same thing. He will meet with his staff for the first time tomorrow. And the week comes to an end. with a major change in US and UN command and the failure to take Hwacheon Dam. So MacArthur is out, and all's well that ends well, right? Wrong. Very, very wrong. The blowback against MacArthur's dismissal is immediate and is massive, and at first it is directed against Harry Truman. Time magazine writes, seldom has a more unpopular man fired a more popular one. And there are calls for MacArthur's reinstatement and calls for Truman's impeachment from outspoken politicians all over the USA. Truman and company have expected there to be some outrage, but some outrage does not even begin to describe it. Arthur Schlesinger and Richard Rover, in their book, The General and the President, write, it is doubtful that there has ever been in this country so violent and spontaneous a discharge of political passion as that provoked by the president's dismissal of the general. Certainly, there has been nothing to match it since the Civil War. And I will tell you all about it starting next week, right here. There is a lot to talk about, and it will take time. I can bring you this fantastic coverage of the Korean War and all the politics surrounding it thanks to the Time Ghost Army. It is the army that finances all of this and keeps it independent. So for more of this over years to come, join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned army officers, and Jan Janicek is the Time Ghost Army Member of the Week. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.